My name is Jack Henderson. I'm a researcher with Radical Exchange Foundation. And this panel is titled Deliberation Technology. The first half of that we'll try to explore during roughly the first half hour, and then in the second half we'll get more into what deliberation technology means and what it might look like. I am joined today with a brilliant panel from which I've learned so much from each of them, and so it's a delight to now be in conversation with them. I'll now give a brief introduction on each of their backgrounds, and then I'll ask for them to kind of explain how their work connects with deliberation, and we'll get into more specifics. So first, we have Tom Atlee, who is joining virtually from, I believe, Eugene, Oregon. Hello, Tom. And
Hi.
Tom is founder and research director of the nonprofit Co-Intelligence Institute. He's the author of 4 books, and Tom is the creator of the Wise Democracy Pattern Language. He researches how to scale citizen and stakeholder dialogues and deliberations on public issues, both in person and virtually, in ways that generate energy and guidance for long-term broad benefit. Joe developed the meaning-based organizational metrics at couchsurfing.com. Then Joe co-founded the Center for Humane Technology with Tristan Harris, and he coined the term time well spent for a family of metrics adopted by teams at Facebook, Google, and Apple. Since then, Joe has founded the School for Social Design, working on the philosophical underpinnings for new business metrics, design methods, and political movements. The central idea is to make people's sources of meaning explicit, so that how meaningful or meaningless things are can be rigorously accounted for. Juha, next to me, serves as the chief executive of Demos Helsinki, with a mission to build a fair, sustainable, and joyful, love that, next era. Juha helps national and local governments, businesses, and NGOs to anticipate and lead key transformations of our century. Juha has studied and written extensively on the need for 21st century governance, focusing on democratic innovations, institutional imagination, and methodical experimentalism. And last but not least, Claudia is the founder and CEO of DemocracyNext, a newly launched international nonprofit, nonpartisan research and action institute. Its mission is to build new institutions for the next democratic paradigm of citizen participation, representation by lot, and deliberation. So just really glad to get into it. So first I'd like to kind of establish some context on the question and topic of deliberation and deliberation technology. So, and I think it fits well with the last panel, which kind of motivated the need for, especially in European context, the European Union, really finding innovative ways to broaden and deepen the democratic bandwidth or bit rate, get more information from the broad public, everyone, network users, as Pooja would put it, to participate in the shared institutions and networks that we're all part of. And typically when we think of increasing the democratic, bit rate, making institutions more democratic, we think of elections. In elections, with that conception of democracy is about, showing up to the ballot and voting, whether it's on candidates or referenda. And while I think voting and elections are an essential part of democracy, our work at Radical Exchange, we spend a lot of time on what's been mentioned, quadratic voting, which is a new way to basically harness our collective intelligence and kind of help us make better collective decisions. Arguably, the more important process comes before the need to vote, and that's discussing what we'd even be voting on in the first place. A vote, a ballot, is really only meaningful in the context of discussions leading up to it. Without deliberation informing and setting the agenda for a ballot, it's a question of how legitimate that vote can be. And if we reduce democracy to this act of voting, especially only every couple of years, it's a narrow and superficial view of citizenship and self-governance. And so arguably the most generative and fundamental arena for improving democracy is helping people have better conversations, better civic discourse, helping us see each other better, helping us understand each other and our differences, respecting those differences, but nonetheless helping reconcile and bridge those differences, which is going to be essential if we are going to be able to cooperate to shape our shared world. And that's where deliberation comes in. So now, Tom, I'll go to you first, but then all of you, I would love for you to weigh in. Just on a little bit more context on your background, how it lends itself to deliberation and what you understand deliberation to mean and what its proper role or roles should be in democracy.
One of the best descriptions I've heard of for the logic of deliberation is that it shifts people from opinion, like public opinion, individual opinion, into public judgment, you know, when you actually considered something well. And I have a sense that can experiences supporting that you can consider something more deeply, more broadly, more long-term, and as you move in that direction, you move into what I would call wisdom or public wisdom, if you can do it collectively. So the ability to vote is an expression of public will, but public will can be filled with folly and violence, and there's many examples of, you know, public will generating bad outcomes. So the idea of having things be more considered allows the whole public, the whole governance, the whole politics, the whole community to be more collectively intelligent, collectively wise, collectively effective, whatever.
Thanks. Who would like to go next?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with everything Thomas said, but I think it's useful to actually maybe define very precisely what we mean by deliberation. And to me, it has two key defining characteristics. And one is about weighing evidence, and the other is about getting to a shared decision. So this is what makes it distinct as well to just dialogue. Of course, dialogue is a part of deliberation in a way, but deliberation actually means about we're weighing evidence together, listening to one another with an explicit aim of trying to find some shared common ground on a decision.
I think I would draw the line between whether you would know what should be done beforehand or not. So you wouldn't, if nobody knows what to do, it wouldn't make sense to vote, right? like, you know, if nobody has any good ideas, okay, let's put it to a vote. Oh shit, right? Like, so that's a case where you would be deliberating. Whereas if you, so I think this is actually these are some of the forces involved. There's a trade-off, you know, in democracy between voting and deliberation, and we've been going more in the voting direction, I think, not even just in democracy, but also in other areas of society, like the like button is a kind of a vote, right? So we've been going more towards voting, less towards talking, and why is that? I think it's because people think they know the answer already, and they just need to get a lot of people to vote for it, or like it, or whatever, right? And so long as you think you know the answer already, you're not really going to be that into deliberation. It seems very expensive. Whereas if you realize that you don't know the answer already, talking becomes much more attractive.
I'll build on that, because I think that's precisely the key thing and key question, at least from my perspective, which is what is the context in which we are right now when we talk about deliberation. And the context in which we are is that we're facing a century of transformations from decarbonizing the energy system and a century of a variety of different crises that we've already realized how they look like in practice. And in that context, what we see is incapacity for collective action. We don't have the governance mechanisms in place. We need to rethink some of our institutions. And in that context, in which we need to maneuver in a high level of ambiguity forward, that to me would lead into essentially deliberation emphasizing two really important things. One is accountability and agency, because we know that there's no single actor who is able to solve our problems, so it needs to be fundamentally something that has a variety of levels of accountability taken into consideration. And then the second is high level of reflection, which deliberative processes can create, which is essentially about recognition of nuance when maneuvering through ambiguity. So I think these two, on a conceptual level, in the context that we're facing right now, would be the things that I would like to add.
I love that. Thanks, everyone. What stands out to me is that just sticking here with this comparison between elections and deliberation is that while there's a role for voting and elections when we need to reach a compromise, it is just sort of, there's no conversation going on, there's no listening, there's no learning. It's kind of a quantitative, final kind of snapshot, a picture of just kind of a static representation of preferences, whereas deliberation is this open and rich, non-linear, creative, and collaborative process. And so I'd love to just dive in a little bit deeper about that aspect of deliberation and also kind of compare just your average natural conversation to more of these structured spaces for deliberation that I know many of you work on. Because, I think some of this civic discourse that we would like to promote will not just happen on its own naturally. We are social beings, we are well adept at communication. That said, it's imperfect, our communication. It's so easy to misunderstand each other or to talk past each other, especially in these kind of deliberative spaces where different people are coming to the table, and the point of deliberation is that it's kind of structured in such a way to reckon and reconcile a lot of those differences. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about why these deliberative spaces work in such a way that, and are structured as such that they bring about this sort of creativity and reconciliation and kind of bridging of diverse perspectives. I think that's a really key insight that certainly voting doesn't do. Voting, again, is useful, but in its current implementations at least are kind of adversarial and competitive, whereas these deliberative spaces are fundamentally collaborative and creative. And I'd love to just hear from all of you a little bit more about where that creativity and that collaboration comes from.
I can start. So one of the special things that happens in deliberation is that people start with different goals and expectations, different ideas of what they want everybody else to do. And that doesn't work. Like mostly people just don't. It's not really a deliberation, I guess, if everybody just comes out doing their own goal. And so what happens is that people look below their goals, below their expectations, for their values, and they surface what's really important to them. And then they find new compromises based on that. So they're like, oh, actually, this exact proposal is not what's important to me, but this underlying value is important to me. Somebody else recognizes that underlying value. They're like, oh, what if we do this other arrangement that supports both of our values and so on. So this is hard work, like finding the values beneath our goals. It takes time, it takes introspection, like you said. Often we need to help each other in doing this. And that's one of the differences with voting. Like, I think that the best spaces for deliberation are, A, they help people do that introspection, so people help each other introspect. And people are with each other. Like they're, like in voting, everybody's in their own little voting booth or whatever, they're with the checkbox on their own. Right? And in deliberative spaces, the ones that work best, people, at least for the duration of the deliberation, are like, okay, we're here to try to get somewhere. I think in the US, jury duty does this very well, where these 12 jurors are stuck together. They have to like report something to a judge. They can't leave until there's a verdict. Like, there's all of these structural supports that make it so they're like, okay, we're in this together. We have to surface what's important. Yeah, that's I think the magic.
Can I jump in? Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and it's important to emphasize the fact that deliberation just doesn't magically happen on its own, that there's actually a lot of design details that need to be in place to create a deliberative space. And so, I mean, before I was at DemocracyNext, I was at the OECD, where on the basis of looking at 600 different examples of citizens' assemblies, which are a form of deliberative process that have taken place, we developed sort of standards for good practice principles for what sort of design elements need to be in place for a deliberation to actually be, on the one hand, effective, so resulting in some shared recommendations, but also on the other hand, done in a way that is democratic and can lead to a sense of legitimacy around this shared set of proposals and outcomes. So, I mean, just to emphasize a bit some of the things you mentioned, you know, deliberation is something that takes time. So on average, these 600 citizens' assemblies, each one of them takes around 40 hours, sometimes more. So that's multiple days of people coming together, and in between those days, reading things, watching videos, grappling with the evidence and the complexity of the issues that they're trying to deliberate on together. It requires actually some evidence and expertise. So again, if we're talking here in the context of democracy and politics, you're not going to ask a group of people what they think about how do we reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030, without them having a chance to actually engage with a lot of some more technical information about that. And then it also requires some skilled facilitation. So again, it's deliberation also needs to have some way, especially when you're bringing in a diversity of people together, to create a space where everybody actually is able to come into a conversation equally and feels comfortable doing so. And perhaps actually jumping just one step back to add one thing, because I really like that you mentioned values. But in a citizens' assembly, actually the first thing that happens before there's any engaging with the evidence and expertise is a conversation about what are our shared values and what are the values that are going to guide this deliberation as well, and then moving through the steps to eventually get to a point of shared recommendations around a policy idea or a topic. But I think overall all these different characteristics show just how different this is to our usual way of taking decisions in a system that's more around elections and voting, which, as we were talking about earlier this morning, we call democratic, but is actually an oligarchic form of decision-making. And deliberation and these deliberative spaces are actually a more genuine form of what I think we can be calling democracy.
Perhaps, well, as you've heard, and in the panelists as well, there are very, very talented designers of such processes, which requires a high level of granularity, ranging from recognition of psychological biases to designing the actual physical space. But the thing that I would want to emphasize here is that think we need to also explore what are, in a way, the artifacts of deliberative processes and deliberative democracy. And what I mean with that is that if you think of elections, there's a lot of symbols in elections, and a lot of those symbols were really valuable when we were building up that democratic system and paradigm, and it really felt something when you went to vote and leave that voting moment, and many, many others as well. And those symbolic artifacts with which you can basically communicate and articulate the values and the importance of any democratic system, basically. And now the challenge that we're facing with deliberative approaches is that when those people leave those situations and those spaces, how we're able to translate that experience into something that is more collective and societal experience. And I think one answer there would be to very intentionally try to create those artifacts and symbols. And I know there's work on that, and I think that work should continue.
Yeah, a number of things. I'd like to expand on the delving into values. I think of values as one of a number of things that underlie the various positions that we take that often make us so different and that make it difficult to come to policy agreements. The things that motivate us, and two other things that are in that realm are the people's needs and their stories. We are trying to satisfy our needs in various ways, as well as manifest and act on our values. And people's stories, what happened to them in their lives, can often be accessed. And you can't disagree with somebody's story, it's just a story. And it explains why you're coming from where you're coming, and people can identify with that. And there's many examples of people sharing the stories that they have that are underlying what they're feeling and how they're responding. And often a doorway into that is through the language of concerns. If somebody is pushing too hard or backed off or whatever, you can always ask them, what's your concern? And have that be a legitimate thing, even if they're disrupting the group. It's like, what's your concern? Tell me what your concern is. And that relates to people feeling heard. When people feel really heard, it's something happens in their psyche and their bodies. They don't have to push, they don't have to withdraw. There's an opening up that's so rare that we actually hear each other. And that phenomena can be used by making sure that people in the situation feel really heard, and that will smooth things out a lot also.
Thank you. Yeah, I think one thing that you were hinting at there that I would like to unpack a bit more, and what Claudia was saying about the necessary skills of facilitation that go into a healthy deliberation are something that I would like to explore a little bit more, because first, Tom, I think I would love to hear from you about why you think that concerns are have insight to them, why they're valuable, why we should value them and lean into them in a healthy deliberation. And it seems like that is one important role of a facilitator. And then I'd also like to expand it a little bit more to think about tapping into those concerns. What are the other things that a facilitator does that requires attention and intention and skill to help facilitate group deliberation?
Yeah, our differences in terms of our positions and policies, there's a sense when you look at the whole thing, it's just different. And maybe we could compromise here and there, but if you actually go into what are my concerns about what you're proposing, that is a doorway into my values, my feelings, my concerns, my needs and stories that I have, whatever, that we can use that as a pathway into those deeper levels. And it also legitimizes, it takes our differences into something that we could actually address together if we wanted to. If we were searching for a whole picture of what's going on in this situation we're struggling with, it's not just you as an individual. You as an individual represent a whole lot of other people who share your concerns, your values, whatever. And if we can actually together address that, whatever the concern is, we have a bigger sense of what the picture is and what's possible to do that would be effective.
I like that, and I like the idea of stories here and how that's a key component of making sure people feel heard. And I'm still just, thinking about how, as you were saying, people have different stories and the importance of trying to find common ground there, and how basically facilitators can help bring that about. And then also kind of doubling down on this idea of concern as kind of, and more broadly, just disagreement or critique, diversity, pluralism, how those things are kind of creative energies that can be harnessed by facilitators, and then also which stories are being brought to the table, basically who is coming to the conversation. And so thinking about kind of the construction of that deliberation, who comes to the table in a citizens' assembly. I guess, first I don't want to go too far ahead here. I can pause there and see if people want to build on that idea of kind of diversity, disagreement as creative energy. And then Claudia, I would like to get a little bit more into citizens' assemblies, how those things are constructed and so forth.
Well, perhaps the only thing I can say before Claudia goes to sortation and how to build those processes is to have as wide of an understanding on diversity as possible. Because in many ways, the challenges that we're facing when discussing our collective problems are challenges in which the perceptions of realities are really far from each other. And that's, of course, a really, really difficult facilitation question, because it's really hard for you to empirically get that visible in a way. So, but at the same time, that is something that good facilitation and process design can make visible, and it is much more powerful if it's explicated. So that level in the challenges in our democracies today is a level I feel we need just to be really conscious about.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with that, and I suppose actually, yeah, this is a good moment to define a little bit what we're talking about with citizens' assemblies, because we've used that term a little bit without explaining it too. But here, when we're talking about citizens' assemblies in the context of this conversation, in the context of democracy and policy making, we're talking about processes where people are selected by a process of sortation, which is a technical term for random selection, so by a lottery process. And usually this means that there's a very, very large number of invitations that get sent out at first. Usually something around 30,000 people get invited to be part of a citizens' assembly. And amongst everybody who accepts that invitation, there's a second lottery that takes place, but this time controlling so that that final group is broadly representative of society. And then there's a question of amongst which criteria, but usually it's at least things like gender, age, socioeconomic status, and geography. So there's a constituting of a broadly representative group of people who are tasked with solving a complex policy issue that's facing the community. And they're given the time and the resources to be able to listen to experts, listen to stakeholders, grapple with that information, listen to one another, and share each other's stories. And then do that really hard work of finding, okay, where do we have common ground on the proposals for how we want to deal with this issue together? And that doesn't mean that 100% of people will 100% agree with everything that comes out of it, because, I mean, that's just not possible, nor I would even argue desirable if we value pluralism in a democracy. But at the same time, when we live in a shared community, whether that's a locally or nationally or otherwise, we need to figure out collectively, what do we want to do about something together? And so in citizens' assemblies, usually there's an aim to find at least 75 to 80% consensus around a recommendation for it to become adopted by the group as a proposal that we work towards. And so the benefit of using sortation to convene a group of people has a few benefits. One is the fact that it's actually the classical democratic way of constituting a governing body. So today we've come to really associate democracy with elections, but actually that's a very recent association between those two concepts. And for a very, very long time in history, democracy has been associated with convening people through sortation and through lottery to come together to make decisions together. So there's a democratic form because it recognizes that everybody actually has the agency and the dignity and the capacity of being able to be involved in shaping the decisions that are affecting their lives. So technically everybody has an equal chance of being selected to be part of a citizens' assembly in the ideal. And then the second aspect, though, is that it helps lead to better decisions. So it creates the conditions actually to bring together a cognitive diversity of perspectives, which so much research from different fields, from psychology to political science to business and otherwise, have shown that having that diversity in and of itself tends to lead to much better decisions. So it's not only more democratic, we also get to better decisions on which quite often these citizens' assemblies are, at the moment anyways, dealing with issues where politicians are also politically stuck. So I think I'll leave it there as an intro to some of these ideas.
I might add some kind of, I'm not anti-citizen assemblies, but I'm going to paint another side.
Okay.
That's not voting. So, citizen assemblies, only a few people end up getting picked, and they need a facilitator, and there's a lot of time investment. And one of the appeals of voting is that it's kind of like systematically facilitated. It can be done in software. Everybody can do it, and it's very little time investment. So what if there's something in between? And there is, like probably some of you know about Polis. Polis is something that's kind of half and half. You upvote little snippets of text, but you can also add a snippet of text. I don't like Polis that much. I mean, I think it's good because it shows an area in which we've underinvested, which is systems that lots and lots of people, everybody could conceivably participate in, and where there's not the intense time investment of a citizen assembly, and where you can hear, there's a huge advantage of everyone participating, which is you can get information from everyone, right? This is like anybody might know, have some special expertise, some special opinion, right? So if you can somehow get information from everybody, this is fabulous. And I have the feeling that in the next 3 years, successors to Polis will appear that use ML, large language models, things like that, to help people do this introspection, to help people separate their values from their goals and expectations and policy preferences, stuff like that, and to do it at a very large scale in massive conversations, and that this will be a really new thing, and that this is the future of democracy.
Can I come back on that?
Yeah, of course.
Sorry, I don't want to dominate the conversation, but I just really disagree with the kind of vision of even what is the ideal, in the sense of, I don't think everybody can or should or wants to participate in everything all the time. And Sortation creates the conditions for people to be able to take turns representing others and being represented. And that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be in connection perhaps with some moments where there is this broader participation when it's really needed. But I just feel like there's a lot of research also that shows that there's a huge bias in who participates in these sort of open participatory things, which there's a noble intention with saying, yes, everybody should be able to have a voice and have a say, but actually we have years of research which shows that it tends to be men, people who are well educated, people who are well off, people who are more urban. And so in some ways it's amplifying the voices of the most privileged. And of course there's design details to improve that and other things, but at the end of the day, it's not actually solving, I think, some of the challenges that we face with how we're taking democratic decisions today.
Juha?
Just so from my perspective, like where we are is in a very specific phase in a journey, essentially, and that phase during which we innovate and come up with these new methodologies in the upcoming years and decades is a phase that should also reflect the ideals of democracy, so imagination, debate, and experimentation. And then at some point we set down on some model and some approaches. So in a way I see this as part of the necessary part of the journey that we should celebrate, and also hope that we celebrate the debates and tensions with it.
Yeah, no, all of you hit on a lot of really interesting points here that I would love to continue to push on. And Joe, yeah, you mentioned Polis. I think it's the best example of taking a lot of these methods and skills that are involved in human-facilitated, in-person civic discourse and mini publics, such as citizens' assemblies, and beginning to bring that into digital spaces, which is really exciting. We typically associate deliberation with people sitting in a room together, and people on this panel know a lot about how to handle people in a room, and it's interesting to think about how to take insights from those methods and begin to mimic the skills of human facilitators in our digital spaces and in our algorithms that we use to curate content and have conversations at scale. And to say a little bit more about Polis, it, as we were saying earlier, it gets into this idea of reconciling diverse perspectives. People are able to, it's situated in a context. A community is deliberating about some question, and they use this online open source software tool called Polis to share their feelings about the problem, the context that the community is deliberating on. And the system uses some basic statistical techniques to cluster together people's opinions on those posts about people's feelings, because you'll see what others have have written, and then you'll just get an option to upvote or downvote those posts. And in the background, the tool will cluster together those different groups about how they feel about particular thoughts about the question. And so that, in a way, moves towards this direction that a facilitator would do in an in-person deliberation, where it recognizes the different viewpoints that are coming to the table. And then what Polis also does that a human facilitator would is that it takes those lines of division, it identifies where the disagreements are, and then people are encouraged, there are incentives to come up with creative new ideas that bridge across those different perspectives. And that's what gets surfaced algorithmically in the platform. And in a in-person conversation, a facilitator might help bring that about. And so I'd like to kind of put those two things in conversation with each other. What is a human facilitator doing? What is Polis doing? Joe, you talk about some improvements upon Polis using natural language processing and so forth. And we can pursue that further, but just what are the things that a human facilitator does that Polis does and that maybe Polis doesn't do, and we should begin to think about technology incorporating more of the skills of human deliberation, but at scale on questions that face not just a community, but nations and international problems. And just where these two things can best complement each other.
Maybe I'll be quick. I think it's about reasons. So the part of Polis, one part that I don't like is this upvote, downvote. That part is like voting, right? But if you knew why the person liked that or didn't like that, what are they scared of? What are they excited about? What seems to solve the problem to them about that particular text snippet? Would that be good for themselves, for their children? Like, why? Right? This is something you can't tell Polis right now. And we don't really know how to get the whys very well from people yet. We don't know when someone clicks a like button on Facebook either, like what they like. And if we did, I think we would discover that there's very different kinds of whys, and some of them are much more worth listening to than others. Some of them are like very important and should count more. And other people, if they knew about that why, would be like, oh yes, now I see that why, and I see me too, like yes. And so that's, I think, the future, that's where this is going to go, and this is what a good facilitator does too, is like uncover the reasons.
Yeah, indeed. And I think actually Polis is often described or talked about as a deliberation tool, but I would argue that it's not actually very deliberative, and it relates to what you're talking about now, because, I mean, even in the language you use to talk about it, it collates people's opinions about things, whereas in a deliberation, it's also about weighing evidence and going through quite a long learning phase, usually, to better understand the depth and the complexity of an issue, a breadth of different perspectives on it, and then having a phase where people talk about it, but not just saying, yes, I agree or not, but really needing to justify why they believe something. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to change their mind. It may mean they have a much stronger, actually in-depth understanding of why they even believe something. So it's not necessarily about getting to convince people or otherwise, but that phase of actually learning, of listening to others, of justifying why you believe something. I think that at the moment we don't really have that in any of the sort of purely digital or at least text-based tools. We've seen technology used to facilitate people deliberating, like through video and through actual conversations and so on. But I'm yet to see it actually being done really well in a purely text-based format. Now, that's not to say we might not use that as a complement or use those inputs to be feeding a deliberation, but I don't think it's actually very deliberative as a tool in the way that it's designed.
So I'll follow up directly on that because, sorry, Tom, do you want to go?
Yeah, I'd like to point out the people who created Polis did not create it to make decisions. They created it as input into conversations. So there's a sense in which this is another form of evidence, to use that language, that deliberative language, And also to handle the Claudia's concerns about the kinds of people who would use such a platform, there have been efforts to take tablets out into communities that would not normally respond and actually sit with people and help them put input into the Polis systems. There's lots of ways to humanize the engagement, and Polis is not the answer. I think there's ways, as Joe was suggesting, it could make it move closer, or things like it move closer and closer to being an answer. But right now, we totally need the nuance that's capable of happening in well-facilitated conversation to deal with what shows up in things like Polis. Check.
And what do you think are some of the things that would complement Polis? I totally agree with the idea that Polis has limits, and that any technology is going to have limits, and it's important to understand those boundaries. And I like the idea of bringing the technology, such as Polis, to a community, and they can kind of shape it to their needs and what they need it for. What do we see as kind of other kinds of deliberative elements that we can begin to bring to these spaces that we would like to become more deliberative, and kind of intermixing online and offline tools, thinking about how citizens' assemblies would fit with Polis and other technologies, and kind of feedback into each other, and harness their complementarities while also understanding when there are limits to any one tool, and the need for them to be situated together in kind of a modular process that is organized for a particular context and community.
So perhaps two notes on that. One is a very, very apparent one, which is that the risk I see is that we take shortcuts with some of the technologies in which we lose the exact value of deliberative processes, which is in reflection, which is about unraveling, uncovering, discussing, and debating. But of course, that's something that is quite well known. But the second to your direct question would be that how I see digital technologies in the context of deliberation is that we are all, as human beings, really different, and we have different biases. So basically having both virtual, physical mechanisms in place, there's a wider set of approaches through which you can, for instance, tackle biases in which somebody is better in social context or in synthesizing information, which means using a lot of power in social situations, and a variety of others. So I see the complementary in the capacity to recognize more diversity and provide more approaches on that diversity.
I love that. Just to double click there, yeah, the idea that it's interesting to think about deliberation as a way to kind of reckon with our biases. There's a great book called Enigma of Reason, which is about rationality, and it kind of argues that our capacity for reason is actually social, and it comes through interaction and deliberation. And that so much of our rationality and intelligence is only through dialogue and deliberation. And I think that's a beautiful way of kind of motivating the importance of deliberation. I guess I'd like to just hear a little bit more about some concrete examples. We've talked about Polis, but going in both other directions, I'd like to hear more about kind of on-the-ground experiments with mini-publics. Claudia, Juha, your work with kind of citizens' assemblies in around the world, and just the kinds of problems that they we're dealing with, and how citizens' assemblies and kind of that bringing diverse perspectives and attempting to bridge them, what that has yielded for various communities around the world.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to answer that. I mean, first of all, there's hundreds of examples. Like in the OECD database that we put together, there's 577 of them, and it was last updated in December. So I would guess there's more than 600 by this stage. So I feel like we're past the stage of experimentation in some ways. Like we actually know quite well what needs to be in place for this to work, and and all of those examples have been connected to government in some way. So they're also not taking place just organized by civil society or academia, but have actually been initiated by authorities who are able to act on them. And I mean, I mentioned a few examples this morning, but they've really ranged from tackling issues from 30-year infrastructure investment plans, how to develop them. In the city of Melbourne, there was a challenge about closing a $900 million budget hole and developing the city's next 10-year, $5 billion plan. That was done with a citizens' assembly. In Ireland, some of the most well-known examples, even though there's been a decade of citizens' assemblies on many, many topics, but they've dealt with 4 different constitutional questions, all of which have gone to referendums on blasphemy, divorce, same-sex marriage, and abortion. And maybe I'll just talk about one example in detail, which was like a hybrid case that I was involved in designing, given this emphasis here also on the technology aspect and so on. So one of the bits of work that I did when I was at the OECD as well was we worked with the region of Cantabria in Spain. And there, for the context, it's a relatively small region, somewhat rural, kind of post-industrial region, where it's a slightly older population, not super high levels of education, high levels of unemployment, a region that sort of feels, let's say, in decline. And there was a citizens panel that was organized by the Ministry of Economy in relation to involving the community of people who live there in determining what should be the priorities for this region of how do we spend our cohesion policy funds. Now that's also a term with a huge amount of jargon that wasn't actually used in the wording of the question that went out to citizens, but basically cohesion policy comes from the European Union. It's the biggest part of the EU's budget, and it works in these 7-year funding cycles that usually relate to huge multi-million euro investments, long-term investments for our community. And so here the ministry involved the everyday people who are living there in setting, okay, what should actually be our spending priorities for this huge pot of money that we get from the EU for this region. And given the context of the population and the fact that this took place actually during COVID times, meant that most of it took place online. And so what that meant was that to fulfill the democratic principles around actually everyone having an equal chance of being selected and so on, meant that there were 10 people who were chosen who didn't have a computer, who didn't know how to use the internet. And so there was also a space that was created at the public library to bring in person the people who didn't have the technology at home, with each of them actually receiving support to use the technology to be able to participate. All the other sort of design principles that I was talking about earlier about what's needed for this to work, like enough time, were still fulfilled. So they still met for 6 full days of deliberation over the course of 3 months to really grapple with, like, it's a complex issue, and they needed time to really develop the proposals for this. So there were still facilitators that were there. They did things on Zoom where they used breakout rooms to still be able to have small group conversations and come back to have plenary discussions. They heard from lots of different experts. They heard from stakeholders from the region, and they had time to develop their recommendations. And it was only at the very end that their last session they were able to do in person because the COVID situation improved a little bit. And all of them were actually very, very grateful to have the chance after this whole experience to even really meet one another, to meet with the minister in person, and so on. But it's just one example that I've talked about in a tiny bit more detail to explain and to maybe make this a bit less abstract for people of what this actually means to design such a very democratic process, but also what considerations need to be taken into account for it to still be democratic, because we assume online that means it's more open to everyone, but actually no, it doesn't. And so it means that if we actually want to still be democratic, there need to be these sorts of supports that are in place, and everyone was paid for their time to do this. And I don't know, I don't remember the details of this, but usually when it's in person, there's childcare provided, either on site or people are paid for the costs of childcare and so on. So all these other considerations are also needed in terms of what we need to do to actually be designing inclusive deliberative spaces too.
Juha, would you like?
Yeah, sure. So a lot of the work we do at Demos Helsinki is basically about how to get the existing institutions to change or create new ones in order to embed some of these ideas into those. And there are 2 openings that I see right now that could be interesting. One is that COVID-19 did a lot of things. One thing that it did, it put governments to the limelight. And essentially what we're seeing right now is governments in Europe, in different parts of the world, national and local level, coming to ask with the context of the climate crisis, essentially saying that we have no idea how to create policies that are legitimate, coherent, how to deliver on those. And that is an agenda and an opening through which one is able to also bring about some of these ideas forward. But it's really, really tricky because you need to engage with processes such as budgeting or policy design that are really technical, very contextual, very entrenched. And that's a lot of the work that we do. So trying to maneuver together with some of those institutions. So for instance, we've been working on the notion of humble governance, which essentially tries to provide a way forward in which you're able to coherently deliver on longer-term policy issues. The other opening that I see right now is somebody mentioned you before in the earlier panel here, and literally like if we talk of our collective challenges that we're facing, just such as the climate crisis, we're trying to solve it from forms that are not meaningful for solving such a problem. So nation state cannot in itself solve the climate crisis, obviously. So there's a very imperative and urgent need to imagine new forms for collective action, which is very abstract, but very concretely, for instance, we're working with the mission-oriented approaches, trying to think of them as ways in which you design an artificial governance modality around that mission, whatever it is, and then start to design the governance mechanisms on accountability, on incentive recognition, on revision, on learning, etc., etc. So those type of things, I think we need much, much more, because as said, it's a journey of experimentation. But when experimenting and imagining with new forms, one can also better than embed deliberative values into the core of those new forms and maneuver forward with that.
That's great. You have a great piece online on new, thinking about the form in transformation and the need for new forms for collective action, one of which I think citizens' assemblies is. And I guess my next question is, while there are so many exciting experiments around the world, it seems like most of them so far, they're getting off the ground, so it's understandable, but that they've mainly played kind of an advisory role inside or actually outside existing power structures, and they do have a lot of democratic legitimacy because they were so participatory and inclusive and collaborative that that's often, I think, maybe where the weight and the power comes from in how it can then shape real political power. But how should we think about that theory of change here, moving from these? They're beyond experiments, as you said now, but how can we push it even further so that these citizens' assemblies and so forth can, come to shape a new democratic future?
Can I say something that no one will like?
Please.
Yeah. So if we're looking at the prevalence of deliberation in society, so we've been talking about it in terms of governance, right? But the kinds of conversations that we want there to be more of, the kinds of service values, introspection, and so on, they don't just happen in governance decisions, right? They happen at the dinner table and on social media and so on, right? And so you have to look at the whole thing, like which way is all of society's communication going, not which way is governance decision communication going, right? And I would say that it's going very strongly the wrong way. Even if you have some success with citizen assemblies and governance in one corner over here, overall, things are going towards, let's call voting just a kind of atomic mechanism, right? So the market would be another kind of atomic mechanism, like buttons and virality would be another kind of atomic mechanism, right? Things are headed really fast and really strongly towards these atomic mechanisms, away from, discursive, whatever. And so I would say that if you wanted to have a theory of change, you would have to address that, not experiments in governance.
Well, I don't know if anybody disagrees with that or doesn't like that. I very much agree with everything you just said, actually, and I think this is very much related to the question you posed and the way you asked it, because at the moment, we've been doing these one-off citizens' assemblies, and they are just advisory, and that's part of the problem. And in terms of actually wanting to have the fuller scale change, I think that's where we need to be institutionalizing and also transferring power, but also thinking about how do we actually incorporate these governance mechanisms that use sortation and deliberation, though, in all sorts of other institutions in our societies. So in our schools, in our workplaces, in our universities, in our banks, other public institutions, because I think that's also where a lot of daily decisions that affect our lives take place. And I think where we see some interesting potential is in some of these initial moves, though, to be creating new institutions and not just these one-off processes. So this morning I mentioned two examples, one in Ostbelgien, which is the German-speaking community of Belgium, where they've essentially set up the world's first second chamber with people selected by lottery. And this has inspired the city of Paris to now establish the Permanent Citizens' Assembly. But there's another really interesting example which will become public in about 2-3 weeks, but it's linked to climate, where there's a European capital city which I worked with a few other experts and other organizations to design a permanent model of citizen deliberation on climate-related decisions that gets incorporated, though, into the institutional framework of how those decisions are made, because actually a lot of the decisions are already taken at the international level at COP. Then there's the EU level framework for how to implement them, then the national level, but actually a lot of the really tricky decisions around how do we actually then implement things, like how do we make sure that within the next 3 years every single home in this city will be insulated, is actually a really hard and very political question. And so having citizen deliberation actually ongoing with a permanent citizens assembly of 100 people from this city, always working on at least 3 different of these kind of how questions, as well as having a mechanism for involving people in times of climate-related crisis like flooding, to make sure it's not just top-down decisions taken, I think is already one move of moving in that direction, because I think the scale of change or the pace of change isn't happening also fast enough with these one-off approaches too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think all of that is so exciting, and you know, to speak to another exciting development in another sphere of power for, you know, discourse, which is Twitter. Twitter's recently released a exciting new feature called Birdwatch, which gets to some of this bridging that we were talking about, but for adding context to posts that people view. It will add context based on those proposals which receive support from diverse perspectives. That's still, you know, there's still flaws with that, as you were saying. It's still bringing a voting component, but it's exciting to see such a large-scale platform such as Twitter begin to move in that direction as well. Tom, you raised your hand, and you know, we only have a couple minutes left, so you and then Juha, if you have final words. But you know, Tom, you've been in this space for you know, longer than I've been alive, I think. What have you learned? And you know, are there any lessons from you know, and wisdom that you could share moving forward?
I just want to toss out another approach that is radically different from any of the things that we're doing. It's based on the citizen assembly model, but it was a thing done in 1991, initiated by Maclean's magazine in Canada, which is their glossy news weekly. And they got a diverse group that was chosen scientifically, not at random, and they got one of the top negotiation people on the planet to work with them for 2.5 days. And the coverage was what was so remarkable. They gave bios of the 12 people that were chosen, just 12 people, and then you got to witness, both on TV and in the page after page after page of the coverage, how these people interacted, what they did. So there were millions of people in Canada basically witnessing, getting a vicarious experience of the remarkable things that can happen in the room. And from my perspective, and it launched conversations all over Canada and got squelched by politicians. From my perspective, the vicarious experience dimension is a whole new thing that very few people are talking about. And if they had done it the following year as well, it had become an iterative thing. Like every year you do this same exercise, things that were problematic in the first exercise and its impact on society will show up in the next one, et cetera. So there's to be a collective national digestion of the situation, that kind of dynamic is not part of the conversation. It's all about relationship to government or relationship to social media or whatever. I'm going, here's a whole nother dimension to figure out how to stick into this. And it's to shape the whole field that we're living in. Check.
Claudia, you were saying that some of these citizens' assemblies take 40 hours or more, and it's a shame that we only have 1 hour. I feel like we've barely, even begun. But Juha, why don't you take the final word?
1 second. Yes. So a final remark. I've always thought theory of change is a really dangerous notion. It implies that actually we might start to believe in our theories of change, whereas democracy is messy and societies are messy, and we need both. So we need that ability to recognize from different domains, because democracy can change from perceptions of agency changing, for instance, and we don't know what we need to be able to imagine those routes for change. But then, of course, we also know that we need those ideas that have technical depth sufficiently so that we can actually implement and experiment with those. And if we're able to create a way to coordinate between these two, I think then we're able to move forward.
Well said. Thanks, Juha. Thank you, everyone.
It's not always easy to recognize. It may look like this, or like this. It may be a burden, but it is a responsibility that we embrace nonetheless. But if it means this for one person and this for someone else, maybe it ultimately means being there for one another. It isn't handed to us, but we know where to find it and how it feels, how it tastes, and what it sounds like when we finally have it. It means different things to different people, but for many, it means everything. And if we all fight for it, it will eventually bring us together.
Ihre Ausreise
Atlas Network is, as the name suggests, a network, and it's global. We work all around the world. We're based in the US. We have about 159 partners in the United States right now, and the bulk of our partners are outside, nearly 500 in total.
Atlas Network, it connects people from all over the world defending the idea of human dignity, defending human rights and personal liberties.
Atlas Network is focusing on, I think, the most important and moral cause in the entire world.
We partner with local innovators, local leaders who understand conditions on the ground in communities facing real challenges. We look at the people from the worldwide freedom movement that are passionate, are ready to make a difference, understand local conditions, and we invest in them.
At Atlas Network, we unleash individual ingenuity to enrich humanity.
The United States does not have a lock on the idea of freedom and liberty. Those ideas are beyond borders.
One of the main goals of Atlas Network is to eradicate poverty around the world, and we do that by investing millions of dollars in our partners' work every year.
Historically, wealthy nations around the world have tried to help low-income countries develop. The way we've been doing it traditionally has not really been working. So there's a movement to do development differently, and that means we need to step back as outsiders and rethink the role that we're playing in helping people in low-income countries achieve their dreams.
We want to make the world a better place. We want to make the world a freer world.
All of us want to leave a legacy and be part of something big to make a better world. This is exactly the work of Atlas Network.
With our growing number of hundreds of successful partners, we're stronger than ever.
Changing the world.
Changing the world.
Changing the world
starts together
with us.